Hello, hello. Welcome back to Let's Talk Ray Bradbury and the third new episode of 2025. Also, the third story in the collection, We'll Always Have Paris from 2009. As with other iterations of the show, I've been working through a collection story by story, doing reviews with the ultimate goal of having eventually at some point read and reviewed each of the roughly 600 short stories written by Ray Bradbury. Today we are moving on to a story called The Twilight Greens. The way that this whole thing works is that I do a brief synopsis of what happens in the story, and I just sort of wrap it up with a very brief analysis of what I thought of the story, what I took away from it, is it worth your time? And I mainly do these stories reviews for my own entertainments, but hopefully one or two of you find them useful or enlightening as well. So here we go. A vigorous 30-year-old man grabs his golf clubs, he hops in the car, and he hopes to get in 8 holes before the end of the day. He gets almost to the golf course when he realizes it's way too dark. I should turn around from home. Just then, before he makes the turn, he notices that there's actually people still out there on the golf course, and he's a little bit curious about this. How can they possibly see? So he goes and he parks behind the golf club, and he gets his clubs, and he walks out, and he strikes up a conversation with one of the men. He realizes that these are all older men, about 30 or 40 years older than he is, and they're out there playing. The old man explains that they call themselves golf widowers. There's a saying that women who are left home by husbands who are obsessed with golf become golf widows, but these men who are out golfing call themselves golf widowers who go out there of their own volition to get away from the home at these hours and to get all their thinking in. The young man, who doesn't quite understand this, is surprised as he's golfing, hitting his ball off into the darkness, that he's almost instinctively is able to find it each and every time. The old man then tells him that, you don't quite understand what's going on here because you're too young to play the Twilight Greens, as he calls golfing at this time. He says in 30 or so years, you may be ready, you may be like us, you maybe want to get away from your home. But he warns him, if you ever come back, don't you dare mention the word marriage around these guys. The young man says, there's no way that I'll ever come back. He can't imagine a time when he would want to be away from home like this and sort of engage in this solitary, lifeless golfing by the motions in the darkness. I thought for sure when I started reading this story that it was going to be a ghost story like The Legend of Bagger Vance, the movie with Will Smith and Matt Damon. It wasn't, though. Despite that, it does very effortlessly evoke a certain vibe about, dusk in the countryside. You imagine the smell of cut grass. You imagine dew forming on the grass and maybe a light mist in the air. And it really sets a whole interesting mood of a day's ending. Bradbury is very efficient at sort of creating this setting in just a matter of a few words. The golf widowers are, as you may have picked up, a bunch of men who have grown old and discontent with their lives, and they're sort of going through the motions. At one point, they describe their relationships back home as having grown cold, and there's wives there, but the house is too empty and are too full, and they want to get away, and so they sort of go here to be alone and to think, but they're alone together, sort of a class of men who are all sort of escaping the same thing. I find this a very interesting thing. The young man doesn't understand this inclination. He can't imagine sort of the fire going out in his life and in his love, and he sort of fears it. He sort of fears this growing old, getting to this time of life where everything is sort of by the motions, yes, you're just sort of going through the motions. And I sort of think about these long marriages that people have, and there's not a lot of, sex is in the past, passion is quite in the past, but they live together, they do things together, and it's sort of, very cold, very cool. It's sort of out of routine, out of, a sense of not knowing anything else in their lives anymore, and you sort of get stuck in that rut. But what do? You're essentially, in these cases, sort of waiting to die almost, and sort of, just doing what you can to survive day to day, but it doesn't really mean a whole lot. It's sort of all your goals have been achieved, but what now? You continue to live, and your body hasn't shut down yet, but on and on life goes. I'm only 42. But, I can already relate a little bit to this, sort of the idea of the fire going out just a little bit in certain aspects of my life, and sort of not being able to find the motivation to do things that I used to do. And I certainly have a lot of life ahead of me should I, not meet a tragic end. But it is relatable, I think, even to people who are not sort of in this senior citizen phase of their life as these characters are, as Bradbury was when he wrote it. But, Bradbury, in the introduction to this collection, he described these stories here as being sort of explosions of creativity, sort of ideas that came to him, and he sort of felt the inclination to write them and not think too much about them and sort of let them work their own magic, sort of alchemy that happens in good fiction. And that's exactly what this feels like. It's not bogged down by a lot of very precise plot, character, any of these things, sort of the rudiments of basically fiction that doesn't transcend. It's not by the numbers, despite the fact that it's about life sort of becoming by the numbers. And I think that's very interesting that so far, 3 stories into this collection, they've all had that sort of feeling of spontaneity and not being overworked. This is a problem that I've run into at various points in my writing life, is that on one hand, there's this idea that you should write a first draft and sort of just hammer it out, and then you fix it and you make it all come together as a piece of art in revision. But at the same time, you can over revise something to the point where you sort of steal its life and sort of beat the life out of it. And I think that it's a very interesting exercise or sort of theme that Bradbury has going here in this collection, to be a type of story that you don't think too much about and you don't overwork, and you sort of just write it hard, get it done, get it out, and then get it published. And, of course, at that point in his life, in his 80s, or actually, late 80s, just before his death, of course, he had the good fortune of, being a legend, so he could have anything published he wants. But I can't help but feel that some of these stories probably would have been rejected, like, for publication by various publishers for magazines and such. If it was coming from a person like me, they would say, this is incomplete. This doesn't quite do it. But I think Bradbury, being an expert, being a master, and also having that influence, was able to publish stories that wouldn't necessarily make it into print for you or I. But nonetheless, they are good stories, and they're very, very efficient and very spare, even in a way. Almost a little bit of Hemingway, I would say, as well. But there you have it, the Twilight Greens. Plenty to think about if you're interested in the thought process of, what is life going to be like when I'm older, when I've achieved my goals, but I keep on living. So there you have it. Next time, we'll be looking at the 4th story in this collection, called The Murderer. The Murder. So be sure to tune in a couple of days to find out what that is about. If in the meantime, I hope you enjoy a good read today. Please subscribe, and I'll see you again next time on Let's Talk Ray Bradbury.